Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. I'm Murray Dahm. I'm the assistant editor of the magazine, and with me and answering the question today is Jasper, the editor of the magazine. So the question we have this time from one of our Patreon supporters, David, is where did the men who made up the Roman army at Cannae come from? Any idea what proportion were veterans versus new recruits? And if a significant number were recruits, what was the impact of tens of thousands of them being lost? Now, I happen to know that Jasper has been doing some reading with one of the essential texts on this. So take it away, Jasper.
Thank you, Murray. Well, I have been reading. It's maybe not going to supply all the answers you want. However, if you are interested in questions of manpower, where the Roman armies came from in sort of the middle to late Republic and the very early Empire, then this book I think is still essential reading and basically unreplaced. The author is Peter Brunt, Brunt, and the book is called Italian Manpower 225 BC to AD 14. It is an Oxford publication from 1971, so it's 50 years old, and I don't think anybody has the time to try and improve on it, because that would be an enormous amount of work. Although you'd think with statistical analysis you might get further with computer help now, but this is based on good old handwork. And he's still not going well. He's going to be able to give you some idea what's going on, because the manpower question is one of those really important features in how Rome got to be so powerful in a fairly short amount of time. As for Cannae, we have to start by saying we're not exactly sure how big the Roman army was, because there's two traditions. Polybius says there were 8 Roman legions, and Livy says I've read both that there were 4 legions, and I've read that there were 8 legions. I looked at Goldsworthy real briefly as well, and he goes with the 8 Roman legions. And Brunt says no, that's just doesn't make sense. It's 2 consular legions of 2 legions each, plus allied troops. So he goes for the smaller numbers, and it's probably mostly because otherwise it really just it doesn't make sense that the known, or as far as we know, Hannibalic army, which was far smaller, made these complicated maneuvers and pulled out this upset, which was a huge victory, even if it was only half the size. The Roman army was only half the size, instead of 80,000 men or in that region. I might point to Gary Brueggemann's article in Ancient Warfare, I think about 2 years ago, where he tries to calculate how this, the famous crescent formation must have fallen back, and basically says this, we basically hardly know how Hannibal's men executed this maneuver, because it is extremely difficult to fall back in the face of an enemy, let alone do that in such a complicated way. Nevertheless, he seems to have managed something, but it might have helped if the Roman army was not twice as big as Hannibal's army. That said, even if we go by 4 legions, then we don't really know where they came from. We do know that the Roman we have fairly consistent reports from the annalistic tradition in Livy, who lists the number of legions, allies, and reinforcements, which were raised every year. So presumably the legions at Cannae were part veterans, part recruits. But this is still the Republic, where armies are raised and sent home still, and reinforced. And I mean, in the Second Punic War, we get more armies that stay in the field. So there are veterans, and there is a very consistent tradition of necessity of serving in the Roman army. So the chance that there are veterans, even if they're newly raised, the chance that a soldier has served before is pretty big at this time, especially as the Romans are raising constantly new armies in the Second Punic War. So that, you know, they start out with the younger generation, and then slowly go up through the age groups. And the older they get, the larger the chance, the higher the chances that they've actually served before. So in that sense, they're almost always veterans among the troops. Where they come from? What was the impact of them being lost? Well, the impact, the only impact that we read about is that the impact is that a large part of the army is gone. Brunt says that before Cannae there were 13 legions in service. After Cannae there were 14, which means that the Romans didn't just lose a lot of men at Cannae, but they also raised new legions, because that's really their only interest. There's certainly something known about the devastation in Italy in this era. I mean, David says farmers and artisans. Most of the Roman soldiers would have been farmers at this time, and a lot of them would be gone or would be serving. It was, in fact, to such a degree that as an emergency measure, the Romans decided to raise 2 legions out of what they called volones, enfranchised slaves, who were presumably bought by the state from their owners, and then set free to serve in the army. And of course, the surviving soldiers from Cannae were enlisted into the so-called legiones cannenses, the legions of Cannae survivors. They were sent to Sicily to sort of restore their morale / reputation. So unfortunately, it's another case where we can't really provide a very satisfying response. What we can do is sort of, when it comes to raising the armies, we can take a look of what Polybius says about how the army was raised. It's a fairly well-known story that, you know, all the prospective recruits were called to the Campus Martius for the legionary tribunes, and then Roman tribe by tribe, the prospective soldiers were called up and chosen by lot. 4 were chosen by lot from each tribe, and then the tribunes for each legion, for the 4 legions, in turn got to choose which man they wanted. I've just been reading in Brunt. It's a fairly complicated story. He basically doesn't buy that Polybius is describing a realistic, what Polybius describes is realistic for the time of the Second Punic War, because the Roman citizens would not just have come from Rome itself, but from the areas around it, possibly from Colonia, further down into Italy. It would be just too impractical to send anybody who might be liable to serve to Rome, then go through the whole process. It might be up to 100,000 people who would have had to go to Rome after the consuls had decided how many new men they needed, then go through the selection process, then to check who might be exempted from service for all kinds of reasons. That would have to be adjudged, and then if those people who were exempted, you know, you'd have to find replacements for them, and then you know who's going to serve in your armies, and then then they go back home, and at a later date they come back for the actual call up to serve, you know, and go on campaign. So he says it must have been certainly not a process that happened in one day, as Polybius suggests, but maybe over a number of days, so that you can deal with a number of groups at a time. Also depending, of course, on the number of new soldiers that they needed. And it might have been, done by a delegated authority in towns and further away from Rome. And then, they all gather in a certain place at an agreed time to form up and become the new army. It's kind of an interesting process. Every Roman citizen was liable to serve, had to serve, and there were certain excuses. Of course, being physically unable to serve is one, and there might be other reasons to serve, but those reasons changed. They might, any reasons to get exemption might also be invalidated by the Roman state if the situation was severe enough, when there was a tumultus, like the emergency situation, which they don't seem to have called after Cannae, but happened, for instance, when I think under Gaius Marius, when the Germans invaded from the north. It's interesting and complicated, and I very much recommend you read this book if you're really deeply interested in finding out what happened and how it happened, that the armies were raised, re-raised, raised again, because it is kind of an interesting and remarkable story that the Romans lose thousands and tens of thousands of men time and again, and they just managed to maintain their army at more or less the same size, even increasing in size. If you look at there's a table here in Brunt that I'm looking at that says that the Roman army was about 27,000 in 218, 50,000 by Trasimenus. He says 65,000 before Cannae, 58,000 afterwards, and then it increases to 80,000 in 212 BC, up to and goes slowly decreases again, apparently as the stress of the war, or the war really is going toward the Romans, is turning towards the Romans in 201 BC, when there's only about 45,000 men in service. Of course, this is all excluding the contributions of the Roman allies in Italy. Does it answer the question, Murray?
I think you've gone over it thoroughly. So there we have it. So hopefully, David, that answers your question. So thanks for joining us on this Ancient Warfare Answers. You too can support us on Patreon. All you need to do is go to patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast and choose your level. You can be a legiones, optio, or centuriones, which give you different benefits, all of which allow you to ask us a question. And hopefully we will try and answer it as best we can.
But you can even answer a question answered, even if you aren't a patron. Just send us an email, and we'll put them on the list.
Fabulous. So join us again for the next Ancient Warfare Answers.
Bye.